Scientist Mel, and you are watching Atheist Edge.
Link between having a belief and whether or not it's true, it might not end up being something about having good reasons, reflective reasons to come to that belief. It may be something like a perceptual belief that would be a proper belief.
Stephen, I hate to do this to you.
No basis for that belief. It's just
Stephen, I hate to do this to you, man. I didn't hit record yet, so I'm going to start over. God damn it. Hey, so I think what we agreed to talk about was basic beliefs, and this isn't. As a total layman, I'm thinking basic beliefs, like properly basic beliefs. Is it something like, I'm sure this is going to be.
Well, you could just title it "Our Basic Beliefs and Grounds for Knowledge." That's fine.
Yeah, it's a little bit more broad than that too, because there's also another kind of set of beliefs that are called entitlements. Those that might not, they may have underlying other beliefs that warrant them, but so they wouldn't be basic, but we should be entitled to them without reflection, like beliefs of children, or do animals have beliefs, and those sorts of things.
That's fine. It's just a general title for him to use. It's fine.
Yeah. Is this going to devolve? I'm going to say this again because I wanted to put it in the video, but do you see this devolving into like a divine command theory talk, or I see that a lot.
What I had hoped was that there's this common idea in the conversation at large about there being default positions, something someone ought to believe when there's little information to go on. And I disagree that that's even possible, because there are things that we're compelled to believe just by existing. So if you have the idea that a causal theory of belief, there's an external world and they cause you to have responses to the world, and one of those responses is belief. Well, if we're perfectly functioning human being, we're entitled to those beliefs that form in that way because we're evolutionarily geared to having proper beliefs. And so that would be a difference also between considering justification being just a set of reasons that lead us to a belief. It can also be considered the proper link between having a belief and the reality that it fits in. So we might have reflective reasons to account for why we believe something, good ones or bad ones, or we might not have any at all. And that's kind of the question that I want to ask. If it turned out, for these philosophical questions to have meaning, it's always good to have a topic for them to be, to chew the cud over. So one of those would be this idea of a default position. And then with the great debate at all, is there something we can come to as far as like global atheism? Is just the idea of God something that we can warrant? And how would we do that based on the kind of conversation we're trying to gear up to have?
So yeah, my position initially is that basic beliefs on their own don't really have a problem. I don't like Plantinga's properly basic beliefs very much, but I don't have an issue with there being beliefs that can be justified purely by having them. Like, I think therefore I am. I think that's a perfect example that would qualify as a basic belief in most epistemologies. But I don't think just any belief could be a basic belief. I don't think a belief in magical leprechauns on Mars could be a basic belief. And the same thing I would apply to the idea of a God. I would see that as somewhat analogous. So I don't think the issue is more about, can there be basic beliefs that are justified by just having them, but what is the scope of those, and what does that standard of evidence justify? Kind of like empirical evidence can justify certain things, it can't justify everything. So what can basic beliefs justify? What is the scope of those beliefs?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you too. I've never been a fan of Plantinga, at least in my understanding of when he goes to explain. It's never clear to me why it is that God follows to it's some kind of properly basic belief. It seems like there has to be a lot of other beliefs that go into it in order to come up with this idea that you believe in. So I've never been happy with it that way.
For sure.
But I've given a scenario before, and I want to see if maybe that will help you understand where I'm at in the kind of religious thinking that I have, and see what you make of it. And I have a scenario that relies on two really easily acceptable presumptions. And if you're interested in those, we can go over that. But it kind of goes like this. Presuming or assuming that there are at least two identical universes that only differ in that one has a God and the other doesn't. all the facts of the matter of your engagement with either kind of reality would be identical to the other, except one has a God, the other doesn't. We're talking about what would count as evidence. If you were placed in one of those, how would you know which kind of universe you were put in? You'd still have religious experience in there one, there'd be God talk, there would be atheism, there would be meaning and morality and logic and all those sorts of features that are in one world, they'd be the same in the other. And for the theist, the concern is, well, I have to assume something about God to make my God talk meaningful. And first of all, it would be, how does it relate to the existence of any world? If I want to say that this is a bad scenario, I have to presume something about what I mean about God to say that he makes an empirical difference to the way things exist. But I don't think he can do that. For the atheist to be able to say that, well, there's no evidence for a God, therefore that's the basis of my belief, I think is mistaken too, because we don't know what would count as evidence if God is something that exists, but has no empirical difference to either world. And at that point, I think the atheist wins, saying, well, then there's pragmatically no difference. But that's not the epistemological question we're asking. So, there'd be no difference between God existing and not existing. I think we can all agree on that. But I'm more interested in what does this do to the atheist and to the theist? And my way of thinking is, either one of them, if you come by the impression that you're in a universe where God exists, well, then it's everything about the kind of creature that you're in and the situation that you find yourself in that would lead you to that kind of thing. And the question for you, Tom, is for the theist, would that be warranted? And I already grant that same kind of thing is going towards the response in atheism. Everything in my human experience leads me to think that we're in a universe without God. And so what would be the appeal outside of evidence, since I'm arguing that there can't be some kind of appeal to evidence in either case, that the atheist is relying on the same kind of warrant, something that's basic in those terms. You can't get behind or beneath or any more elaborative than the fact that I disbelieve that there's a God, or I believe that there's a God in just the general sense. And first of all, just need to make sure, Tom, that you understand what I've said. I kind of threw a lot at you at once.
Sure. So you're saying there's two empirically equivalent universes where all the facts are the exact same, one with a God, one without. And you're asking, since there's no difference between the two, there could be a God in one, and we can't falsify or verify the God in either, since they're both exactly identical. And so why would the theist or the atheist both be, or either be justified or unjustified in this case, since there's no way to differentiate between the two?
Perfect. Yeah.
And from my starting point, I would say that to take the basic belief language, like beliefs might be justified prior to having defeaters, but we have a significant amount of defeaters for human imagination. Like we know we imagine lots of stuff. So my epistemology starts with, I think therefore I am, and then there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. So I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. I do not consider it to be a properly basic or a basic belief that the unicorn exists. I think that first we have to say, we have to apply some kind of method to differentiate, is the unicorn real or something true in my sensory experience independent of my imagination. And until we can do that, I think it's justified to conclude it's purely in my imagination. So I think that the position the atheist takes is that I have this idea of a God in my head, and we would need some way to show that that idea corresponds to something in reality independent of my head. And if you can't do that, then it's reasonable to conclude it's just in my head. Whereas the theist says, I have this idea in my head and I think it corresponds to reality. Why? That would be where I would be like, well, if you don't have some kind of a justification there, I wouldn't think that would qualify as a basic belief any more so than my belief that there is no God also doesn't qualify as a basic belief. I'm justified off the fact that there's no evidence. There's no way to show it's independent of my imagination. And we have good reason to believe that lots of our imaginary things don't exist. Therefore, inductively, we can conclude that God also probably doesn't exist. So I don't see parallel between atheism and theism in those two worldviews, because mine seems to have a justification for why I'm an atheist, which is that most of our ideas are imaginary and don't exist. This is one of those ideas. It's probably one of the imaginary ones, whereas the theist seems to be taking the opposite route and just claiming there's a basic belief here, whereas in my atheism I don't have the basic belief, so it wouldn't be parallel, I don't think.
Sure, and that's a good intro to kind of what we began talking about with what's the difference between justification and having a proper link from belief to truth, or having the right to think that something is true, put it that way. And so when you're talking about imagination, you could be influenced to that kind of view, depending on the strength of your impressions of the way things are. I wouldn't consider something to be just a product of my imagination if it was sufficiently strong. I would like to do the thing that you're talking about and discount just the idea of a unicorn. It's very easy for me to discount because not giving it any merit. There's no real type of interaction with my life that would suggest that my intuitions were wrong. And there'd be a difference that I'm trying to make between an imagination, imaginary things, and having an intuition. So that may be contextual based on who it is that's asking the question or trying to surmise things from their own experience. And so I maybe want to caution about the use of the terms imaginary and not. I think we would all agree that there might be a difference between imagining a unicorn and imagining that there is some metaphysical underpinning to the way things are. I think reality itself is just existing is absurd enough to make any question not so definitive as to say one way or the other.
Well, the context here, when I'm using imaginary, every idea humans have start as being imaginary first, because it comes to us in the form of imagination. So that's all I mean by imaginary. It's an idea, hypothesis, theory. All of those are imaginary. It's just so anything that we think about is imaginary first, because it's an idea in our head, and then we'd want to show, is it just an idea in our head, or is it also correspond to something independent of our head? So imaginary here is not a dichotomy. It can be both. I can have an imaginary cup and the cup exists. It's over there. So it's not exclusive in that sense. Jim had a question.
Pardon?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to jump in and disrupt the flow, but I already had a couple of questions. So I think I forget who was talking about it. Leprechauns on the moon. Oh yeah, it was Tom. So that made me think, okay, some beliefs are not basic and not justified. And I just, if you could clarify why some beliefs are basic and some are not. And if someone makes a claim that, okay, there are leprechauns on the moon, and then you say that I'm not going to even entertain that, is that like a form of igtheism? Like the claim is so absurd that I'm not going to even entertain it? Is it something like that?
Well, that's kind of the question we're going into. It's like, what is the grounds of a basic belief? What is the scope? What does qualify? What doesn't qualify? So my standard is any claim any humans make, I'm never going to discount it offhand because of how ridiculous it is. If you claim there's a square circle in your pocket, I'm happy to accept that. I just asked for the exact same criteria. How do you differentiate the imagination aspect to, does this correspond to something independent of your imagination? And if you could provide that, I'd be happy to accept that too. So like if you, I said there's a round square in my pocket and it gives me answers to every mathematical question ever asked, and I can test you and you get them right every time, then I'm like, okay, I'll grant that as evidence for a round square. I wouldn't even care. Just so I would never reject anything out of hand, no matter how ridiculous it is. I don't include that in my epistemology. So my question is if we grant the possibility of basic beliefs, which I do, what is the scope of these beliefs? Can they apply to literally anything? I think we both agree that no, they can't. There's some limit. And my standard is, of course, if they have defeaters, then that kind of is the limit. And the defeaters that we have is that human intuition and ideas are very fallible. And so we could inductively say that most of them, any off the cuff idea we have is probably going to be false, since most of them are. Even in science, most of our theories are false. So if you want to say that you have some belief and like a god or whatever, and it's warranted or justified in some way, I would need that way to meet this standard of there is a way to differentiate imagination from reality or experienced reality, to show that it actually does correspond to something independent of our imagination, and which would be what I would require beyond just it being a basic belief. I don't think being a basic belief could meet that standard in this context. It can for some things, like I exist, that counts, but I don't think it could do it for a God, which means I don't think basic beliefs would count for a God in the same way they would for an atheist, because the atheist doesn't need a basic belief here. The atheist can say, I know there's some difference between when I imagine a unicorn, when I see a unicorn, I want some kind of criteria to differentiate between those two things, and then that qualifies as my justification for rejecting God as just being one of the imaginary things.
I think this might be a perfect time to chime in on my second question. So I think therefore I am, is that, I mean, we all just agree on that. What I'm asking is, are we all theists, atheists, everybody we're all just agreeing to presuppose that reality is real? The whole brain in the vat? I mean, are we just looking past that and we're all just starting at, okay, reality is real?
Well,
you don't even need to. So I think therefore I am doesn't say reality is obviously real, but it doesn't say we're not a brain in a vat. Like I can think and still be a brain in the vat. So my thinking doesn't show I'm not a brain in the vat, or I'm not in the matrix, or I'm not being deluded by Descartes' demon. I just know that I exist. Whatever the thinking is, that thing exists.
What about a simulation? What if we're a sentient simulation?
That means
God.
So if we're in a simulation and I'm thinking, then something in that simulation is producing my thought. And so something in that simulation is me.
Well, yeah, we can get into, there are people that object to that. Russell would be one. There's a host of problems with that. But just to narrow it down on the kind of conversation that we can have, Jim, is to say that Descartes and Locke would be two different directions that the modern era took us in thinking. And it can be applied to the whole, I think, therefore I am problem. And the way both of them settle what they can believe, what they can rely on as far as what is a true belief in their mind, is whether or not it's a clear, vivid, and distinct, unavoidable idea that they're having. And this is what goes into my saying that God may be that kind of thing. The difference between Descartes and Locke was that Locke said that it's the external world that is causing me to have the beliefs that I have. And that line of thinking goes all the way up through Dretske and Goldman, who came up with this idea of a causal theory of belief. There are problems with it, as there are with any other ones, but that's a basic line of reasoning. And so in this sense, a basic belief would be a belief that we possess that has no explanation for why it exists within us. And I think God may be one of those types of things, just as if I'm in an environment, let's say I know what an ambush looks like. I've been to war. These are and I go into a situation where all of a sudden I have this intuition that, gee, an ambush is around the corner. And I have to ask certain questions, just like Tom is wanting us to do. Am I at combat with someone? Are these the kinds of situations that right now exist, that also exist where a likelihood is better that I'm mistaken, or better that I'm actually right about the intuition I'm having? And what I'm saying with this kind of scenario is that, at least for the theist, I'm not in some kind of situation to say that my belief is unfounded, because if I'm the kind of creature in the kind of environment that has brought this thought to me involuntarily, and it's clear and it's persuasive in the Dretskian sense, if there's a belief that I have and I'm powerless to do anything about it, then I just have to accept it. That's kind of his idea about it. That would qualify as something maybe as is either a properly basic belief, something that doesn't have any reason for its existence, or at least an epistemic entitlement. I'm entitled to think this way because that's how I'm geared to think, and I'm doing my best to be open-minded about some kind of refutation or accepting some alternate world that's close to what I'm thinking, if I had good reasons to do that, but I'm just epistemically unable to get there. So that's the kind of warrant that I'm talking about. It may or may not involve being able to give epistemic reasons that count as some kind of justification, but it certainly gives warrant in giving a proper link between having a belief and why I might think it should be persuasive. Does that kind of cover some of the ground that you had, Jim, and then Tom, what you had just been explaining in your idea?
Yeah, both of you, that was real good explanations. I'm going to save this last question because I'll let you guys go. I feel I'm disrupting your all's flow, but I've got another question. I'll hang on to it though.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on what Stephen said there. So I would say that if we take that definition as an epistemic basis for warranted beliefs or entitled beliefs of some kind, it seems like every epileptic would be entitled to their beliefs about what they have seizures on, because it's a very powerful belief they have. They can't explain what caused them to have it. Therefore, they would be justified in all of the same ways you would, as saying this is a real thing that would be there. And it seems like like any basic belief they have, like I have a basic belief in voodoo or whatever, and voodoo, if it makes no empirical predictions about what would be different in the world with voodoo versus without voodoo, it seems like that ambiguity that it provides to the theory would actually add justification to it based on your definition. Whereas it seems that's counterintuitive, that it should be the opposite is the case, that if you add ambiguity to your theory, that I believe there is this thing, but I believe there is this thing, and it doesn't make any difference in the world, seems to make it less reasonable to believe, not more reasonable to believe.
Well, it depends on, to me, on the global scale, when you're talking about global and local atheism, you have the idea that just the concept of God, having a belief in a general, there's a metaphysical reason why things are the way they are, and some call that God. That's one thing to say. And then there's the idea of a particular instance of that kind of metaphysical explanation, where we have Yahweh, we have Shiva, or whatever kind of God that you can imagine. Those are, to me, two different things. I'm interested really in one of those things, and I could care less about the other. I really don't care about localized gods. And really, ultimately, I care about the question and how we go about justifying things, not necessarily where we fall in believing in these things or disbelieving. Doesn't really concern me.
Oh yeah, just to clarify, so I'm taking the global atheist position here, and I'm saying that if we take the global atheist position or any particular or general theist position, and we say which of these is more warranted or more justified, it seems to me the global atheist position is more warranted because we have this justification that pretty much everything humans think of is imaginary and fake. Like every one of our theories has been wrong in the past. Every one of our gods has been wrong in the past. Every one of our ideas has been wrong in the past, pretty much all of them. Therefore, it's reasonable to infer any new idea we have is going to also be initially wrong. And therefore, we have this additional criteria that's required for any idea, just any idea we want at all, that it needs to provide some way to differentiate, is it just one of the imaginary things or does it correspond to reality? And without that additional thing there, then I can conclude all ideas are imaginary.
Well, that's what you began by saying. When I was trying to make a difference and say that, no, there's a difference between an imaginary unicorn and this idea of whether or not there's a global, something to a global idea or concept of God. And you kind of backed off of that and said, well, every idea that we have is imaginary. So I don't really mean to say that it seems like that's kind of like you're going back on it now and kind of underscoring what you seem to be implying before, which is, yeah, you do mean it in that sense where it's trivial that this belief is something that's compelling to a believer because it is imaginary. Well, mathematics is imaginary. Everything, like you were saying, is imaginary. And it's not the fact that it's imaginary that's a problem for you. You're saying we want a way to discriminate or discern between just things that are of the imagination and things which have some application or are caused by the reality that we live in.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. So I don't add any specifics there whatsoever. I just say there is some difference between our imagination and reality. We know that. So we can imagine some things that definitely don't exist in reality with some level of certainty, round squares, for example. So if you want to claim that there is something you're imagining and it does exist in reality, just using a basic flow chart or whatever, we can show that, okay, so we want to show it's of the class of the things that are imaginary and exist, and not of the class of the things that are imaginary and don't exist. So we need some further feature to show it's not, since just saying it's imaginary doesn't work. If it's just imaginary, it could be of either class. We want to know if it's in the class of imaginary and does exist, which means you need an additional feature there to show, to lean towards one or the other. And that additional feature could be anything. You can propose any feature you want. You could say, I have a magic 8-ball, and the magic 8-ball telling me that is a possible feature you could use. It's just anything is possible here. So I place no limits on what that criteria may be. I'm just saying you need a criteria to additionally to the fact that it's in our imagination. And it seems like the criteria you're proposing is that it's a strong belief of some kind that is apparent to us and seems to be given to us by our environment. And so if I accept that criteria, well then, okay, it seems like every epileptic, if we just grant for the sake of argument that your criteria is correct, and that works as a way to differentiate imagination from reality, then every epileptic seems justified in every one of their beliefs because they have an equally strong or stronger experience based on my understanding of epilepsy, that their experience during the epileptic seizures are extremely profound. They don't have any explanation for why they have these things. They're very specific and real. They have experiences with other beings and all kinds of stuff. And so if your criteria is correct, then their beliefs seem to be correct, which seems to be a defeater for that criterion of a way to justify that these imaginary things are more than just imaginary.
Well, I would say that you're creating an instance that's a particular. It's more of an anecdote than saying something objective about that situation. It would be like leaving the diagnosis of a mental illness to the mentally ill, versus having as your idyllic standard someone that's perfectly capable of reasoning. They can reflect on their own things, and this is not a particular person, but the idyllic situation, so that you have a situation where any person like that would step into with the facts given and be able to say something in agreement with another same kind of reasoning being as that. Meaning that if you're talking about an epileptic, and I don't know anything about epilepsy and the kinds of experiences that they have, I would assume that they would know that there's a difference between the experiences that they are having versus experiences that others aren't having. The important thing in that is to say how that might be the same or different than having a belief in God. Having a belief in God does not entail religious experience. It's not required to. So it would just be that you're a particular kind of thinker in a particular kind of circumstance that causes you to have the idea of some kind of metaphysical underpinning of the universe or reality, and there would be no experience with it. The criteria that you're talking about, that I'm asking about, would be, are you saying that this isn't sufficient to be warrant, or this isn't sufficient to be called justification? Because I'll agree with you on the justification. If justification to you means having particular reasons that would lead you to think of this conclusion.
Well, no, I would say justification would require more than that. So I'd say that I have particular reasons to think of this conclusion, that's forming a hypothesis. That is immediately just imaginary. And then you need something additional to that to go on to show it's more than imaginary. So everything in forming a hypothesis is imaginary. All of the reasons you have for believing it is all imaginary until you have some additional feature to go beyond that, go beyond the I constructed this hypothesis. Then, like in science, we say, well, okay, I can make novel testable predictions. These novel testable predictions are confirmed. I think that is a good criterion to differentiate imagination from reality. But just the forming of the hypothesis would not be. I would not count that as a justification. So in the point of the epileptic example is that is just a thing, and like assuming they have no idea what epilepsy is, assuming we're living 3,000 years ago, whatever, there's an epileptic and they just don't know it. They're having these extremely profound experiences of volcano god or whatever, and they have no idea why they're having them, and they explain this to the people like, oh, I had these visions of this volcano god, and that's why the volcano is exploding. And everyone's like, ah, that makes sense to me. And they all group together and say, they all have this kind of collective experience of the thing now, because there's this idea that's been imposed on an explanation and they all adopted the same thing. I would not consider them justified to believe that, even though it's a common experience among their people. They all have a reason based off of their environment to believe this, which is told by their elders and their mystic authorities. I would not consider that to be a good justified belief. Maybe at the time it could have been for specific reasons, but if we put that in the context of today, because we know about epilepsy, we could not say that just because if I lived in that context, it would not be justified for me to believe that, because I also have this knowledge of epilepsy as a thing. So when you combine those two facts, since we know human experiences of the same kind you seem to be describing, whether it's caused by an unknown reason that I believe in God, or an epileptic reason I believe in God, or any other reason I believe in God, those themselves, just the reasons that we form the hypotheses, are not sufficient to warrant belief or to act as a justification in my epistemology. You need something more than that, because there are infinitely many false beliefs that can meet that same criteria. It doesn't seem like a good metric to differentiate. Is it just imaginary and real, or imaginary and non-real?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You're talking about you're hinting at reliabilism, in that it's not a good way to reliably get to some determination of what's true.
Well, I'm not saying reliably here. I would say that it has to be able to, in the first place, like it has to get to those at all. So I can show it can do it unreliably to some degree, but I don't see any cases where it has done it reliably. So I wouldn't say there's like some probability one way or the other. I'm saying there's only seems to be probability in one direction, which is in the not correct direction, as far as I can tell.
Okay, well, would you suggest that your perceptions and your immediate judgments about your perceptions are not warranted? They don't wouldn't classify as being properly basic belief forming ways to knowledge? Like your eyes, your skin, your taste, smell, those sorts of things?
On their own, no. I would require more.
So without those, where are you at with how you're going to be a verificationist, or some kind of justification along that kind of route, where you're giving reasons for? If you can't rely on how you think, if you can't rely on your senses, then how do you form this kind of methodology that you're suggesting that has to be better than imagination, without some basis of appealing to those kinds of things that would get you there?
Well, I'd say that my imagination doesn't seem to accurately represent the reality I perceive. And so if I can use my imagination to accurately represent the reality I receive to some degree, I would say that that specific case would be justified. So for example, I could say, I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. But if I imagine that the universe has gravity, and I can predict if gravity is there, then I can see gravitational waves if we do this experiment. And it happens, like, okay, that's a really good reason to believe, because my mind seems to fail at everything when I'm trying to describe reality. It does not work well at describing reality. But in this one case, with this one theory, it seems to work really, really well for some reason.
This might be a good place to butt in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead and finish up, Tom. I think this is a good place to butt in without derailing the conversation. Stephen, so pareidolia, am I saying that right?
Yep.
The idea that patterns and meaning exists where it doesn't. We can all agree that's an evolutionary trait, and I would argue that it's not completely vestigial. That I think it still serves some purpose even now, but in our primitive days, I think that, because you implied earlier that we have an inherent, maybe even a primal need, or just a basic belief in higher power. I think that was. I don't want to straw man you.
I think some people do. Yes.
Okay.
I think some people are like, I think most people have that.
Do you think that pareidolia, or that need to find patterns in things, since it was, I mean, we can all agree that it was an actual survival mechanism at one time, and I believe it still is. Do you think that might be a natural causal agent for that belief in supernatural phenomena?
Absolutely. And again, you have to understand what my concern is. It's not that I couldn't agree with every argument that an atheist would put out there. I agree with most of them. My thing is just what is the way out of this conundrum? Because what you're saying I can agree with, but it doesn't defeat the idea that there is some global existing God, some metaphysical thing about how the world hangs together, that wouldn't, your argument or your pointing out that fact would not discount. Does that make sense? So in other words, let's say that there exists this Yahweh kind of God that's concerned about the welfare of human beings out of all of creation, and wants to intercede and do these things to make human existence flourish. That would not be a defeater to that kind of God. How would, if as a, let's say the typical evangelical has to know and believe certain things, correct things about God in order for their salvation to take a hold, that wouldn't be a defeater. It would maybe be something that they could argue in favor of that kind of view. They might say that how else, if I'm not geared to be the kind of thinker I am, put in the particular kind of circumstances that would cause me to think of God, how else would God come to mind? And because God has come to mind, all of these things, that just kind of feeds into that kind of, and sure, you can rationalize on either side about how that works, but it doesn't really, for me, get me anywhere as far as epistemy goes. I would agree that that's a good reason not to take your uncontrolled beliefs that you have as seriously as you would like to, but also it's a caution on the other end to not let it seem like it's a defeater as much as you would want it to be.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So Stephen, we're talking about like the difference between there is absolutely no God, that claim, and the claim that there is some God, just general theism, general atheism. And we're saying which of those strong positions is more justified, right?
Yeah, I don't know if it helps at this point to talk about strong and your psychological state of mind with these beliefs. I don't think that's helpful. What I do say is there is a for theists, for most of them, I don't think that you can just believe in God and will yourself to believe. There has to be something compelling about having that belief that sustains it. And I think it's more, it at least from an epistemological standpoint, doesn't have to be like a culturally based thing. I could be out in the middle of nowhere, this general idea of some underpinning of the way things are that might be intelligent or have put this world together, that kind of thing, that God notion comes to me outside of any kind of cultural reference. And it's a very compelling thing for me to believe. No matter else what I believe, in all honesty, I'm trying to get at the truth. I just can't not believe this because it's so compelling, even though I'm open to all the reasons why I might be wrong. And that's the kind of dilemma that I'm trying to see if we can discuss and talk about warrant in that sense versus justification. In your sense that I think you're talking about it, I can agree that there aren't really, for me, good epistemological reasons that can lead a person to think that there is a God more definitively than there isn't. But I also understand the theist who might be in a situation where everything about their human experience, how they're geared to think, and the world that they've encountered has led them to think of this thing that they're calling God. From there, yes, it's fallible, you can be wrong. And I think the only thing that that kind of person can do is admit that these are the reasons why they're pursuing that sort of belief system in light of other things that might temper their desire to say that they know for sure certain things about it. And I think the only thing that's ethically responsible for that kind of person to do is try and flesh out what they mean by God, how that actually does pragmatically fit into human well-being and their life. And then aside from how religion has gone in the world, as far as I see it, use that to make a better world. I don't think there's a lot of times where I think it's gone a different direction than it should have, but that would be the way that I think ethically a person should go with holding that sort of belief. So
Right. And
it's more
so,
about
so my
warranted
initial, what, so my initial response is that, so imagine we're walking in the desert and this belief comes upon me. I just get overwhelmed with this feeling of whatever. And this is interpreted in my mind as some kind of a thing. I believe this thing, whatever it is. It could be God, could be leprechauns, could be anything. And would just the fact that I had this overwhelming feeling that I can't control and that I'm forced to believe be a warrant for my believing that it's true? I would say no. I would say that based on our prior knowledge of epilepsy and how brains work and how we are determined by things, that the fact that I had this overwhelming feeling that I couldn't control or explain would not be sufficient warrant, because we have defeaters for those. We already have prior knowledge for defeaters of those. Like maybe if we lived 4,000 years ago and we had this, then maybe that could have qualified then, but I don't think it does now. Would we have modern science and we know enough about brains to know that, yeah, we have those, people have those all the time for all kinds of things. That does not seem to be like a warrant any longer, because it seems to have been defeated by neurology.
I certainly, there's plenty of people besides me that would take issue with that, but let me put it in a more relevant way as far as the kind of argument that I think that you're trying to make. And that would be, there's one thing to say that a belief forms, and there's another thing to say that the belief sustains. And I think that if you're open to experience changing your mind, experience is what has led you to this belief. And if you're open to experience changing your mind about the belief that has formed, but in being open to that change of mind, you haven't been, then I don't think that anything serves as a defeater, or could be, just because the argument exists does not make it a defeater for that person or for that circumstance in general at all. It's just that for some people in particular, these reasons, these arguments, these ways of thinking outweigh the kinds of ideas that they have in relation to how they fit in with their experience of life. For instance, I could say that at one point there's this view that Christians have of this absolutist type of thing. They could sustain that belief as long as they believed it, but experience might come along and they come across a rational argument for, let's say, theodicy. Why does evil exist? And for a lot of people that start to ask those questions, as long as they're open to whatever the future holds in terms of, if they think it's what they believe is false now, they actually track with what they believe is true. That's great. That's kind of where we want to get to. But that experience of having a loving God may justify having the belief that there is a loving God, just in the circumstances where that holds true in somebody's life. As soon as you experience evil, that is when it becomes, for that individual person, not a warranted belief, unless you can explain why a loving God can exist in relation to the evil in the world that you're experiencing. So
I'm not quite sure I follow that part. So the fact that you can explain some contrary data, like any theory can do that. Post hoc reasoning is a thing. Any theory can only post hoc reasons. It's literally impossible to 100% falsify anything. You could say that I believe that the world is round, and we go into space and we see the world is round, but we could be in the matrix. So my flat earth theory is not defeated. Am I still warranted in believing my flat earth theory? I would say no, because the evidence we have, while it isn't a 100% absolute certainty defeater, does move the dial to some degree, which is over some certain threshold that makes it, this belief is warranted to have versus not warranted to have. So if we have sufficient evidence contrary to that position, that does count as a defeater for it, even though it doesn't give us 100% certainty that it is wrong. So if we can get to some degree, I think that overwhelms the warrant.
Right, and again, what I'm saying is, when I start talking about features that this God should have, those are all things that defeaters should be able to stand up against. It's not the metaphysical idea that we're talking about. We're talking about an instance of that metaphysical idea. A loving God is a particular. And when you make a particular out of God, that's when you can start saying things empirically. So what I'm saying is, when a belief forms, I'm not talking about it in the sense of justification. So go back to the original conversation where I'm saying a belief forms and a belief will sustain in light of the kind of creature that you are and the circumstances you are. Those will be the kinds of beliefs that you will have in general, and they will only sustain as long as they continue to be part of your experience and make sense of your experience. And once they no longer do, not only will you not believe them, but if you just out of psychological mischievousness try to keep onto those old beliefs, then you would not be warranted. This goes outside of having explanations. I'm talking in terms of entitlements. When could something not be an entitlement where it used to be? And then I'm tying that into your notion and the popular notion of what justification is, having specific reasons that should take any ordinary person from having no belief to having either belief or disbelief, depending on the strength of the argument made with those kinds of facts of the matter. So that's your sense of justification. Before I was just going with the general idea of basic beliefs in the context of entitlements. So I don't think that you can force yourself to believe something, and I think your mind will change exactly as it changes your mind.
Perfect. So a flat earther has the experience the world is flat. He looks around, everything looks flat as far as we can tell the world's flat. And so he has this direct experience, this intuition, and he seems very entitled because he can't not believe it. He's forced to believe it. So that belief that he's come upon that the world is flat is a basic belief for him. And he's been presented with the feeders. The world is round. We have all the scientific evidence the world is round. It's like, no, my belief sustains. This is still relevant to my everyday life. Every time I look around me, the world is perfectly flat. There is no changes. Every time I test it, every time I try to look over the ocean, it looks perfectly flat. So based on your definition, it would seem like his belief is justified in this case. Like if we take the two worldviews, world's flat, world is round, we present all the scientific data, and this guy's belief sustains, it seems that based on your definition, his belief would be justified.
It depends. If that person was never in a position to have his experience change his mind, then yes, I think he would be warranted. However,
what do you mean by having his experiences change his mind? So like if I'm out in the world, and the world, if I look across the plains of America, it all looks pretty fucking flat, right? So if that's my experience, that's the only view that I can ever have, yes, I think his view is warranted because it's caused by those facts of the matter. However, if you change your perspective, and we can do that today, which makes a flat earther incorrect, we can go about different empirical ways of experiencing reality differently that might defeat that initial sense that the world is flat. So if I look at go out into space, I'm going to have a different experience that causes me, because it's based on a fact of the matter, that causes me to change my beliefs. That's responsive. So in terms of the original argument that I'm saying, if there's two identical universes that only differ in the fact that there's a God, everything about the experience in both worlds are identical, and I can't have any perspective except for the fact that it ends up that I either believe or I disbelieve, or somewhere in the middle, I have no opinion at all. And that's just the way the world has made me form beliefs. Does that make sense? Yeah. But I'm going to try to, using the flat earther example, which is more about justification because we're providing reasons. It's not about the equivalent worlds hypothesis. I want to move back to that one in a bit. But first, just on the flat earther one, before we go to space, so we don't have spaceships yet, only the metrics he has, he's just looking at like the world and using lasers or whatever, the little laser thingies that can measure the rotation of the Earth. Using those, we present those to him. He's like, these don't convince me. I don't see how these are relevant to how the world is flat. But everybody else knows, yeah, these do in fact show the world is round. These are very good evidence the world is round. But they don't convince him. He doesn't understand how these relate to the world being round. So he's been presented with empirical evidence, and he just rejects it. He just says, these don't convince me. So that his belief sustains. Now, from my perspective, from an impartial observer perspective, I'd see the evidence here is very sufficient. He just doesn't understand it. And so I don't think he's warranted in this belief. So I think there are defeaters. He just doesn't understand those defeaters. So if we are in a position where we have someone who's saying there's these two identical worlds or whatever, and there's no defeaters, and we say, well, actually there are defeaters, you just don't understand them. Well, I think that person isn't warranted. So the position here is that there are defeaters. So we can say that if you, for any idea at all humans have, it's imaginary and not real. We should conclude it is not real first. Immediately start, it's not real. And that is a defeater because of how bad human psychology is, because of every hallucination, delusion, misconception, failed hypothesis. Every idea we have is wrong, which sets a huge degree of reliability that any idea we have should be started as wrong.
I don't see that at all. I don't see that as possibly true because, again, we reason and we trust, at least we trust every judgment that we have, and we trust every sensation that we have until there's a reason not to trust it. That's the default position. If there's any default position, are the immediate ideas that come from our senses, at least in one sense. There may be more or I don't know, but at least that's one sense in which I don't think that you could coherently suggest that there's a way to get about the truth while denying that most of the things that come up in our mind, just because they're imaginary, they're also false.
I think what Tom is referring to, there can be some glitches in our reasoning system, and Tom is if I believe you're talking about the flat earther in that movie, the guy actually spent $14,000 and he bought this laser mech and he knew exactly how it worked. He knew exactly what he should be looking for. And he said, I'm going to prove that the earth is flat because there's not going to be a 14-degree drift on this. And therefore the earth is not spinning. And sure enough, he got a 14-degree drift and something glitched in his reasoning system. And he said, well, that can't be right. I have to find a way to justify that, because that showed exactly what the scientists say. And, it must be malfunctioning.
Right. But the thing is, it's not up to him to say whether or not he's warranted or justified. It's an objective conversation. So we can talk about terms, warrant in terms of being objective, without saying that any judgment that we have is fallible or infallible. I would agree with Tom that, yeah, every idea that we have could be mistaken, but I completely disagree from everything that we experience, that when we form beliefs, they lead to things that suggest that they are false beliefs. Instead, really, when I see a cat on the mat, it's because the fact that there is a cat on the mat. When I see that I'm holding up a hand, I'm not being fooled, and my judgment is correct that there is a hand in front of me. That kind of thinking has been the majority of contemporary thinking when it comes to epistemology, and when we account for any kind of belief, whether it's a basic belief or an entitlement or something where you want to say these are reasons that exist to think of this conclusion as being true by any person, because any ordinary person would accept those reasons. But those are all premised from the beginning on the fact that we reason the same way and we experience reality in roughly the same way. So that's what reality is, what makes our statements objective in the first place, which is why I'm saying to Tom, I don't think you can get there in saying or encouraging the idea that almost every idea that we have is false. I can say that every idea that we have has the potential to being false, but I can't justify it because everything in my experience says that when a belief forms in me, it's appropriate. And if it wouldn't, then at least there's a logical argument that natural selection would have selected against me as that kind of agent in the world. I would have been killed off for bad mistakes. You know what I mean?
Well, then you get Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, which is the opposite, but different argument. So my position is that for all of those beliefs, like I see a cat on the mat, that has additional references to it, additional evidence, not just the fact that I experience it. Just the fact that I experience it, not good enough. But the fact that I experience it and can make predictions, I think that would be good enough. So I think there's a cat on the mat. If I throw a mouse, it's going to chase the mouse and eat the mouse. And there's tons of these. We have lots and lots of past predictions that have been made about cats. There's a cat in the bushes. If someone goes close to it, the cat is going to eat the person. That's a good prediction.
However, those are all premised on the very first thing being true. I experience a cat on the mat for the fact that there's a cat on the mat. And anything else, if I throw a mouse at it, it's still a matter of experience and my observation and my judgments about all of those facts of the matter that lead into all these other beliefs that form about any situation. So I have to come at it from at least saying that I can trust my senses, because everything comes through them.
Right. That's fine. So I can say that there's some of the senses can be trustworthy, some of them can't, and we need to differentiate between the two. And here's a way to do that. We can say that I have this sense there's a cat. Now, if my sense that the cat is real is true, independent of my imagination, then I should be able to come up with lots of different imaginary things that could happen. The cat's going to magically transform into an elephant. Now, if my experience corresponds to reality, then I should be able to create some kind of a model that's going to predict what the cat is going to do. And that model is more likely to correspond to what exists independent of my imagination than one that I predict that doesn't do that. So if I can, so just the experience itself doesn't count as good enough. You have to have the experience plus some kind of model that can predict what's going to happen, what you're going to experience in the future. If you have that, that's good justification. Whereas if you just have, I have this experience, that's bad justification, because we know there's lots and lots of those that are wrong.
Yeah, I don't want to beat the horse to death, but I think it bears to mention that the kinds of things that would be verification for you would necessarily be from the kind of world that you can't imagine. So it would only be.
I never refuted that. So again, there's infinitely many things we can imagine. What qualifies as good justification is if I have a experience and then have a very particular model that can predict what I'm going to experience in the future, which is hard. It's very, very hard for us to do that. Which is because it's very, very hard for us to do that, that gives us a much more stronger reason to believe that that is true and corresponds to the thing independent than any of the other ones. So I think that that counts as a good justification, and just the experience itself does not. So the experience plus model that can predict future experiences is good.
Tom, you said that, you know, a pattern of getting it right in the past. That you alluded to patterns, like if everything that you've thought about a subject has turned out to be right, the odds of whatever your new idea is increased, that it being right. And yes. That's correct? Okay. So let me flip it. Dark matter, you know, 95% of everything in the universe we can't even explain. Right? So dark matter, dark energy, we call it that, but we have no damn clue what it is. So that being the case, I mean, any hypothesis we throw at it, we have nothing to base it on. So if we're stuck at a null hypothesis, you know, we have nowhere to, where's our foothold on this? That was a really bad question. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let me read it right off.
I think what you're trying to say is that if there's a scenario where there's no, that there are multiple narratives that we could say are justifiable or warranted because we could imagine them and we could model them and they could predict the future, one of them might have utilitarian value if it does what one of our models says it should do. But that's a pragmatic issue. And that's also, all of those models are things necessarily that we can imagine. So it doesn't settle the question of whether or not everything is imaginable and we can rule out what's less imaginable by giving it another imaginable scenario where it can be, where it can obtain. So there's a vicious circle that falls into play when you start talking about when you can rely on your imagination and when you can't. The classic explanation would be is that it's not up to one person. If any person that's on the whole, just like anybody else, reasons the same way, experiences the world the same way, they're not malfunctioning in any way, say they don't have epilepsy, they don't have, I don't know, ADHD or something else that might have effects on their memories or the ability to think and reason. That kind of person steps into a situation and has an experience, then what kinds of experiences they have would be objective, because anybody—
I'm going to object right there really quick. So from my perspective, all brains are like an epileptic brain. So I'm saying every brain, every human brain has flaws. I just used the extreme of epilepsy to show an example, but I'd say every human brain, there is no such thing as a perfectly rational human brain.
I'm not talking about perfectly rational human beings at this point. I'm talking about
that would be
ordinary,
just
I'm talking about ordinary people, and ordinary people do exist. That's a bulk of people. That's how you come to call them ordinary.
I'm classifying ordinary people as the same as epileptics. You should not trust your experiences, just like an epileptic should not instantly trust your experiences.
No. That's an epistemic problem, and I'm talking about a categorical way to talk about people that makes things objective, not whether or not that we're fallible or that. But there are a class of people that do not have the same kind of reasoning incapacities as other people. So
I don't know about that. I mean, let's consider the founder of Christianity. Basically, he was riding a horse to Damascus. For all we know, he was completely, just like you say, one of those people that zero major defects. But guess what? He fell off his horse, flashing bright light. He was immobilized. He was blinded for 3 days. He had visual and auditory hallucinations. Hey, I mean.
So he's not.
What is the
he's not
Occam's razor
functioning
there?
as an ordinary human being. He's had
No, that's begging the question. You can't say whether he is or isn't. That would be something we have to leave as an unknown. We do not know.
No, it's less. It's if you say, but and Jim is going to have to agree because he gave the scenario. He's suggesting that it's extraordinary. He's not an ordinary person because he fell. He had some kind of damage to his head. He's now seeing things as a result of that. So it's not within the regular scope of a functioning human brain that's ordinary.
But there's two major ways we can look at what happened there. One is supernatural, and by fiat, by default, it has to be the least probable explanation.
Well,
yeah,
I kind of want to just move in a slightly different direction.
Okay.
So we know that most ordinary humans have type 1 and type 2 biases, type 2 and 2 errors, the hyperactive agency detector. We see a rustle in the bushes, we think it's a lion because it's good for survival. So every single human, every ordinary natural human will feel this, and every ordinary natural human is going to be wrong. And so we can apply the same kind of idea to Jim's dark matter, dark energy example. We can say, okay, what's causing dark matter, dark energy? I think it's a mind of some kind. We can conclude that has been defeated. That argument 100% is just, it's far more likely that's just our type 1 and type 2 fallacies produced by the errors in our brain. Our epileptic analogy, there's a problem in our brain, we hyperactive agency detection, it's probably not that. But if we conclude a different thing, like it's physics of some kind, we have lots of good examples of, well, this physics kind of answer is able to make predictions about the future that give us an accurate idea in our head. You're right, we can't, it's also going to be imaginary. We have an imaginary idea about what's going to happen in the future, and it gets it right. That is good reason, even though it's still imaginary, to conclude it's also more than imaginary. Because of all the imaginary things, we have very few of them can tell us accurately about the future of our experience and imagination. So it seems like there's a difference between those two. One is if we claim dark matter, dark energy, or we have these two equivalent empirical universes. You say it's caused by a God, I say it's caused by physics, or just there is no God, the hard atheist position, there is no gods whatsoever. Now I can say the reason I believe that is because we have this hyperactive agency detector in our brain where we like to input, as just normal everyday human beings, the average human being will input agency into things naturally, and they're wrong all the time. We're wrong about everything. Hindus have millions of gods for everything. So any of those kinds of beliefs are more likely to be wrong than true. Whereas this other kind of belief, this kinds of physics predictions belief, seem to do a really good job and are more likely to be real than imaginary. And that seems to give me a stronger position on the there is no God position, because any of our preconceived notions of a God seem to be defeated by the fact that any average ordinary human is going to have type 1 and type 2 errors and have a hyperactive agency detector. Whereas my model, the non-God model, which is predicated on just prediction, does seem to have a very successful past of doing this, being able to tell us about the future before we know it with a high level of reliability, which gives us a reason to go beyond its imaginary. It's probably something more than imaginary, even though it's still something in our imagination.
You had said that that any ordinary person going into, they would have this type 1 reaction to a rustling in the bush, that they would feel a certain way. And I would disagree that ultimately, because they feel a certain way, that they couldn't conclude correctly by the conditions that they're in, that it may or may not be. A person in Africa where lions exist would be more likely to have that pay off. And a person that's in, the United States, no, when they have that feeling, they know what to do with that feeling because of the other things that they can reason through. So it's not just a matter of there being a compelling feeling that something is true. We also reason. So what I'm asking is, when we only have one kind of perspective that we have, and there is a compelling feeling that we're having some kind of belief form about the way reality hangs together, but we are without a means of getting any other perspective, what would make us unwarranted in having that belief?
If we know the foundation of that belief is present in all regular average day humans, and the foundation of that belief is false.
But it doesn't distinguish between the person in America and the person in Africa. They would all come to, because of the same circumstances, they would all come to the same belief. But the African where there are lions would be right. So you can't just say because we have this natural tendency, we should think that we're wrong. I'm saying no, a person in the right conditions has
more likely wrong
because it's right.
So if we have this human tendency, this feeling is going to be felt by every human being all over the world. A very, very small percentage of them are going to be right. The vast majority are going to be wrong. And it's not just in the case of lions. People do this for a monster under the bed. And pretty much everyone who believes there's a monster under the bed is wrong, unless you think the monster is like a person hiding there or something. Or people who see aliens on the moon. Every single one of them is probably wrong. So this isn't just, the lion is one example of an evolutionarily beneficial belief that we had, that belief applies to everything in society. What causes fire? A mind. What causes thunder? A mind. What causes volcanoes? A mind. The proclivity of this belief is so common throughout human society everywhere in the world, which is applied to everything in the world, that it's pretty much always wrong. Now, of course, it can be right in the lion case, which is an extremely small percentage of cases where it is correct.
I think you're taking a categorical approach that's just it's hasty, because we do generalize in this way all the time, and it does have the same kind of payout, even if it's not a particular situation in Africa. What I'm saying is that if it does have a payoff, that's the reason why it's still a big way that we come to take action or inaction based on this impulse type of thing. If it still has the payoff in a pragmatic sense, you can't just appeal to the fact that we as human beings do this certain sort of reasoning and say, therefore, it's wrong, because as often as it might be wrong, it is right. What I'm asking for is some other reason than just stating that we're these kinds of thinkers. We can say, yes, and thinking about this particular topic has features that makes it wrong. So
when you said it's as often as it is wrong, it is right. That seems like it's a 50-50. Now, my position is that this belief is wrong 99.999999999, lots of 9% of the time, but it's right 0.1% of the time. And that 0.1% of the time are the people who survive in some cases, which then causes that belief to be more prevalent, but it's still wrong 99% of the time. Like if you have a bacteria that go in every direction and there's only food in one direction, 99% of the bacteria are going to die. They all believe they're going in the right direction. They're all going in different directions. Only one of them is right, but that one survives. So there isn't a...
Can you maybe give me 3 examples of what you're talking about other than lions in Africa? Something that's everyday, ordinary, that happens.
There's a monster under the bed. There's a person in the shadows. There's a spaceship in the air. There's a God in the volcano. There's a God in the fire. There's an evil organization who's watching me every minute of the day.
How many ordinary people believe those sorts of things?
Throughout history, majority of them. Like if we're talking about human history, the vast majority.
We're talking at a moment in time, today, ordinary people.
Well, no, today there's a lot of. Well, today there's a lot of background justification, like we have good evidence our world is round because we can go to space. So if we include the background evidence, then it biases most people. Well, even still, most people today on Earth still believe in magic and stuff too. But throughout human history, if we're discounting all of the modern scientific data that debunks these ideas, most people believe these ideas. So they were believed until defeaters were provided. Today we have defeaters, and throughout all history they were wrong. Zeus was in the clouds creating lightning. Most people believe that. Most people believe that there was a volcano god. Most people believe that there were Hindu gods. Most people believe that there were gods in Echo who created echoes in the Roman gods. Most people believed there were these agency things behind every phenomenon: wind, fire, lightning, water, tornadoes, everybody. They were all wrong.
I'm not saying it's a majority, but there is a substantial percentage of the population. We'll just go with the United States that really I'm not going to say the only, but the main reason that they're following laws and doing what they think is the right thing is because they think there's a unsubstantiated intelligent agent that's watching over them and going to make sure that they do the right thing. And now I'm not saying it's everyone, but it's a substantial percentage that if it wasn't there, they would just run wild. And they would probably go to prison, and you can't reproduce in prison. And then they would, it's still a survival mechanism. If you want to propagate, you really need to be free to do that. And is that making any sense? So it still exists.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that you can't appeal to a feature of the way that we think in order to say what we're thinking is wrong. To make it objective, it has to be something in line with the way reality is. So just because, in this case, I would be denying that it's true that we can be coherentists and come up with a theory of we could predict something about the way the world is just by reasoning alone and in our heads about the way things. I think what makes things objective are facts of the matter in the world. And so when we come to judge these things, there either is a payoff in some way or there isn't. And we would abandon the ideas that didn't have a payoff in terms of whether it's survivalistic or for human well-being. Those sorts of ideas would die off if they didn't have a reality to their lives.
The payoff for divine thinking is obvious. It increases comfort. It sets you at ease. It wards off the fear of the unknown, the dark, death. So there's probably health benefits to it.
Yeah, there probably are.
There's tons
but
of
I'm
benefits.
more interested in the objective reasons that we have for saying that there might be something to any of these particular instances of religious thinking that there are. I'm
confused by your argument here. So I grant that there are payoffs to Christianity, but I don't grant that there are any warrants in that belief just because there are payoffs.
Well, right, and I would agree with that too. But what I'm saying is, why is it that beliefs sustain? And I'm thinking that ordinary people want to believe what is true, and theists would be some of those ordinary people, and the majority of people understand that there's the kind of difficulties today that you're talking about. There are these good reasons for thinking otherwise, but they still are powerless to believe any other way that they do. And without a really good reason to say, this is pure psychology that you're experiencing, and I don't want to assume that it's just pure psychology, what would be a good reason to change somebody's mind? And what I think you're saying, Tom, is that eventually, over time, there will become a point in time where man has cured himself of this kind of thinking altogether.
Sure, definitely.
I'm not convinced that that's true because it has a functional role in our epistemology and in how we come to judgments in general.
I'm not sure what you mean there has a function in our epistemology. Like the God hypothesis is rejected majority of philosophers and scientists, so it doesn't really play much of a role any more today. But I'd say, like, if we were moths, imagine if all human beings were moths and we all have this desire to fly to the big light. We see a big light, fly into the big light. And then we find out that most of the time when moths fly to the big light, they get zapped and die. We could probably conclude that, yeah, this is not a good belief. This is usually a false belief, and we should probably reject it. Even though he did have some benefit in the past, we know for a fact that this is not a good belief. We should definitely get rid of this belief because it's killing people. I think that does count as a good defeater. Like that belief has been defeated. You should not believe go to the big light is a good idea anymore, because the vast majority of the time you do it, you get zapped by a bug zapper. So if we can show that a constant pervasive belief in an average everyday human with their mind operating normally as it would leads to a failure of reasoning that's like we get zapped by a bug zapper, that counts as a defeater for all such beliefs. Because we know this was from an evolutionary belief. It had an advantage at this point. Now it leads to zap. So if we can say God is the same kind of a belief as the moth wanting to go towards the light and then getting zapped because there's somebody there who's like, "Ooh, moth like to go towards light. Let's put a light here that zaps them." We can conclude that those kinds of beliefs, while they are natural in humans and did have an evolutionary advantage, are false beliefs, predominantly false beliefs, because we know they fail for these specific reasons in pretty much all cases, which are very universal. So I don't understand the two claims you made there. Is why would we not conclude that this predominantly false belief is false in all cases, most likely false in all cases? And what does this have to do with our epistemic basis of reasoning? Like why you said this has some kind of benefit to it, where I don't see any benefit.
I'm saying it's a necessity. I'm saying basic beliefs, we cannot get away from having them. There's at least the case to be made that basic beliefs are part of our perceptual apparatus. And there's ways that we think about the world that are not based on other beliefs that we have. We just think that way. And you can trace that back to Kant or Kant, however you want to pronounce it, where we have this apperception. This is the way we come to the world, and this is how we view the world. So I'm saying just because we can't agree with you and say that just because we think this way, it's going to be able to be determined any other way than pragmatic. And an example would be that the necessity of thinking about how we think as being a requirement of having any experience at all is the fact of causality. Hume pointed out that we can't go from observing consistently conjoined events to some kind of idea that one is causal to the other. And Kant said that, well, really, we have to see it that way because there's a time element involved where one happens before the other, not just that they're consistently conjoined. One appearing has an effect on the other one and is caused by that. Those are all space, time. Those are all ways that are mandatory for us to think in order to have any experience.
Apologies to interrupt. So I'm happy to grant basic beliefs. Like I don't use them in my epistemology, but I can grant them. So causality could be a basic belief. The external world could be a basic belief. I'm happy to grant those. But basic beliefs could only apply to those things which maybe there is two empirically equivalent worlds. But I'm saying there's not. There are certain basic beliefs that have been defeated. These are gone. These are not things that can count as basic beliefs before. And the hyperactive agency detection system, which are in humans, is one of those things. This one has been defeated. This one is like the moth flying to the bright light kind of thing. That we know this fails with such a high propensity that this kind of belief can't count as a basic belief anymore, any more than flat Earth could count as a basic belief anymore.
Yeah, but I'm just not convinced with what you're saying. The fact that a person having this way of seeing the world is common to the way animals see the world. These are all, I'm not talking about basic beliefs at this point. I'm talking about entitlements. Ideas that come about naturally because they are caused by our environment and the kind of creature that we are. We rely on those to take action. And we do that every single day. The fact that one of those ways that we react with the world is being hyper-conscious doesn't mean that our judgments are going to be totally contingent to that. What makes a difference, what would make your comment a defeater, is if there was some way that we could rule out one instance of that application over some other instance. And in the case
what do you mean by rule out one instance over another instance?
Well, again, going back to your example of hyperagency being mostly wrong, but sometimes right, I don't care about what the odds are. I want to know what are the conditions it's going to be right under. And it's more probable that a person is going to see a rustling in the African bush and think it's going to be a lion than it is in some other circumstance. What I'm saying is that if there is no way to say that here are the other things that indicate this is actually how that instinct or intuition or way of looking at the world is playing out, and that these other things are what indicate it's actually false, probability doesn't matter. The probability is the same. We don't have enough information to determine whether or not we're properly or appropriately having this intuition play itself out in our lives. And that's the point I'm bringing out by talking about two empirically identical universes. If that situation is true, then we don't know what would count as extra, some other perspective that would clear it up, whether or not we're an Austinite or we're someone from Leon or somewhere, on the African plain. But in that instance, we don't have any kinds of ways to do that. And what we're left with is this impression, and it's not one that needs to be tied with something that has been defeated, like a loving God, or Jesus is God, or Buddha was right about compassion. Those kinds of ideas, those are all local, and we could accept them all as having been defeated. But this is an epistemological question about a global concept that does not have any particular definition. It's an idea of how reality hangs together and how we could get away from a strong compulsion of thinking there's more to reality just on this thing that we're geared to think a certain way. I'm saying, yes, we are geared to think certain ways, and that leads us to this idea of there either being a God or disbelieving that there's a God, no matter how you define it, and then left with this other fact that we're also geared to think in ways that are fallible. Like you're saying, we have this tendency to put agency where agency doesn't exist. Those are all facts of being human. And I just don't see that in the kind of scenario I'm setting up that we can answer the kind of question with just saying, well, it's probably wrong. No, I want to do a little bit more than probably. I can agree with you that probably we're mistaken about a lot of things that we think, but all I'm warranted to think is wrong are the things I can go beyond and put something more definitive on it. I'm just not convinced.
As far as we know.
Well, I pretty much agree with what you said there. But what I would say is that, if we had no other background knowledge, we just have these basic beliefs or of agency and stuff. We see something, we apply agency to it. We know literally nothing else. Then maybe I'd say you're right. But we do have a lot of background informations that do tell us the context of when these beliefs are correct and when these beliefs are incorrect. They're correct when they kill us. If we have a belief and it can lead to a higher propensity of death than life, that's when those beliefs are sometimes correct. Like if there's a lion in the bushes, we run away, it saves our lives. That tends to be, because we know this is an evolutionary trait, those are the cases when this belief is correct. Every other case is incorrect. Every single other case that we've ever tested has been incorrect here. So it seems like if you were right and we had no other knowledge whatsoever about when we apply these hyperactive agency beliefs, then maybe you could be correct. Like if we were a kid and our parent told us that Santa Claus exists and that's the only evidence we have, maybe we would be warranted in believing Santa Claus exists. But once we become adults and we know enough about Santa to realize it's an imaginary thing, it's no longer warranted to believe in Santa. So if you have some kind of significant ignorance of all of the data, and you have just some basis of a basic belief and literally nothing else to go off of, then maybe that could be warranted. But because we do have a significant basis of other data available to us, rejecting that data would be unreasonable. And so you have to include that data, which does include a defeater for this belief, which is the fact that our belief that there is an agency in things is only true when it's going to benefit our survival. That's why we have the belief. And every other case has been wrong. And this is one of those other cases. This is like, well, if there's a God and there's no empirical difference in the world, that's one of the things that's not going to affect whether or not we survive and reproduce. So that's one of the wrong cases.
But why would it be wrong? You don't have to think of this global God in terms of agency either. It could be something like Spinoza, where you have the aspects of this thing that exists on a metaphysical level are why the world unfolds as it does. It has a causal relation or some kind of inductive relation to the way things are.
What do you mean by God here? Because when I'm talking about God, I mean a consciousness of some kind, a
Yeah,
supreme
I'm
consciousness.
saying that that's unnecessary to have. That's a particular instance. I'm talking about the metaphysical global idea of what we mean when we say something like God. It's not something that we're putting specific terms on, except to say it has something to do with the way things are.
Now
So
I'm
it doesn't.
confused. I'm a little
That
confused.
doesn't. Yeah, that doesn't. When you say that God is something that underpins reality, you're not necessarily having to appeal to anything that's conscious at all.
Okay. Well,
And I'm giving the example of like Spinoza's God.
yeah,
I'm just
pantheism.
saying
So I'm still confused here. So is your claim that I have a basic belief that there is some fundamental nature to reality, and that's just that itself would be the extent of the God claim?
it could be. What I'm saying is that's the sort of God that we're talking about. And what you're saying are defeaters are things that don't apply to that way of thinking.
I agree completely, because when I'm talking about the position of atheism that there is absolutely no God, naturalistic pantheism isn't included. That would not be a God. Naturalistic pantheism would not be a God. That is scientific atheism, essentially. Pretty much any version of pantheism that doesn't include consciousness would not be considered a God by most atheist definition. So I don't like. Would you think most atheists would conclude that if there's just some essence of the universe that's non-conscious, that would be the kind of God that they're rejecting with global atheism? Like I don't think global atheism is the position that there is no fundamental nature to reality.
For it to be beneficial evolutionarily, it would have to be a non-conscious force that actually improved our well-being, that actually increased survivability.
I think that's separate a little bit.
No?
So,
Okay.
So I want to talk about what you mean by global atheism here. So when I say global atheism, reject the existence of a God, I literally mean something conscious. I wouldn't reject the existence of a naturalistic pantheism. I literally use that in most of my arguments. I don't think most atheists wouldn't say that there's no fundamental nature to reality. Like, I don't know of any atheists who would ever say that. So I don't think global atheism entails the position that there is nothing fundamental to the universe. That would seem strange to me.
Yeah, but well, what I'm trying to do is kind of figure out. We haven't met before, haven't talked. There's lots of ideas that go in the atheist camp, and I'm trying to flesh out a bunch of them at once as simply as I can. So my point is not necessarily to argue that what we're talking about is conscious or unconscious. I'm saying that what you're saying defeats the argument, doesn't defeat it, because it could be one or the other. And you're specifically having to then say, yes, I'm only talking about a conscious God. But then you would have to determine what we mean by conscious. Does consciousness entail that it must be interactive in some way? And if it's not interactive, then it's as a metaphysical proposition, you can't rule it out that God is conscious, even though we may be putting agency in the place where it shouldn't be. We could all agree that that could be the case. But what I want to know is how we would know whether it was the case.
Okay, so a few things there. The first thing is that, so I don't think any version of atheism rules out naturalistic pantheism. I think they all accept that as a non-God fundamental nature of reality. Like most physics stuff would qualify as naturalistic pantheism. It's just the fundamental nature of reality, which is a non-conscious thing. I don't know of any version of atheism which rules that out. So when I'm talking about a God, I'm talking about a conscious thing. Doesn't need to be, it could be a deistic God that doesn't interact. I'm fine with that. My claim is that any kind of belief that we have as humans that there is some conscious force out there, some agent-based force, is significantly more likely to be wrong, except in very few cases pertaining to whether or not we survive and reproduce, because we know this belief is a result of evolution. Therefore, any application of this belief, regardless of how we got it, towards something that isn't directly resulted from our evolutionary past is probably wrong in pretty much every case.
Let me maybe go at a different angle at this with you, and it might be more interesting, because I can agree with everything, every argument that an atheist has. I can agree with them. Yeah, I can see where it might be more likely. The argument, I could grant you the argument that you're trying to make. I don't think I would, as far as in terms of just being somebody that is involved in the philosophy of what counts as good defeaters. To me, that doesn't do it. But I can get beyond that to do the more interesting thing, which is to say, for an ordinary person, what should they do with the beliefs that they have? Because when we're talking about justification, we're not really, it doesn't seem to me that we're talking about what the point of a statement is to determine whether or not it's true. That's kind of a trivial thing. What we're trying to do is figure out how we should act in the world, how we should understand the world, and whether or not a statement is appropriate to that end. So we come about that really socially. So we come up with the kind of methods that we're going to employ and the kind of criteria that would satisfy us as ordinary people in the things. And one of those would be like predictability, like you're saying. So in that sense, this is a conversation about that Clifford and James had a long time ago about the ethics, what's right to believe. Not necessarily it's true and that's what makes it right to believe, but if we're in a situation where we're fallibilist and we know that whatever we can justify, still we could be wrong about it, then what's right to believe? So in the case where a person could admit completely to what you're saying, but in the Dretskian sense, they are so compelled without any kind of cultural or some other undue influence on them, forming a belief that there is some kind of agency in the world. How should they respond to that when they can't use that reasoning that you're talking about, that kind of justification?
Stephen, are you opposed to withholding? Are you opposed to withholding judgment in the lack of evidence?
What I'm saying is,
do you believe that we need to slap the table and make a decision?
I'm saying that it is impossible to will yourself to believe or withhold judgment or disbelieve. These are all propositional attitudes that naturally form. And I'm going back to Locke and to Kant and to Descartes, saying that what makes something compelling and different than any other belief that we have is that it's compelling. It's clear, it's vivid, it's distinct. And if that's what the modern era began to sprout all these ideas that we have now, what has changed in the contemporary scene that would get us away from thinking that? And it seems to me, given a history of contemporary thought, we haven't gotten away from those ideas. In fact, most of neuroscience agrees that this is the kind of thing. We can't just choose what we're going to believe. You can look at Goldman in conjunction with Churchland and Dennett in the kind of neuro science that's going on in the philosophy of that kind of science that's going on.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So yes, our beliefs are determined by our neurology in lots of ways. We can't change them. But is that belief warranted? Like you said earlier, if it's warranted is an objective question. It's not about your subjective mentality and whether or not you can choose to believe or not. That's irrelevant. Like I could shock you in your brain, make you believe something, doesn't make it warranted. So the question is it warranted objectively, independent of the fact that it's really compelling to you or the fact that it sustains in your life? Those are just subjective features that make you determined. So like, for example, the case I was talking about with Richard Brown, a professor on my YouTube channel, is that imagine if you're a kid and your parents tell you Santa Claus exists. You could be warranted in that belief because your greatest source of knowledge is your parents. And so you trust what they say. And so you're warranted to believe Santa Claus is real. My parents told me Santa Claus exists. But then if you grow up as an adult and now you have the greater body of information that Santa Claus is really it's a made up thing of some guy in ancient England or whatever, then you're no longer warranted because now you have a defeater for that information. So I grant basic beliefs can be justified, but we have a defeater for certain beliefs, so they can no longer be basic beliefs. Those aren't possible. One of those is agency detection. So I grant basic beliefs are possible. If we had literally no other knowledge other than I have this basic belief of a God and knew nothing else about the world, maybe. But we aren't at that point anymore. We're several thousand years past that point where this belief has been defeated. So,
but I wonder how. And what I'm saying, I'm coming back to this the two universe scenario where everything is. Not only do you have religious experience and belief and atheism and everything in both universes, but we're the same kind of human being in both universes. And this is the same thing as being in Austin, Texas, as it is being in somewhere in the bush in Africa. In both universes, we are still the kind of person that sees agency everywhere. And what I want from that scenario is to be able to answer which kind of universe am I in? And if that, just stating that fact of that where I'm this kind of person can't determine for me in that hypothetical which kind of universe I am, then what I'm asking you is what kind of merit or priority should we give that kind of reasoning or that kind of premise in order to agree with your conclusion that maybe we're wrong when we put that agency there?
Well, I'd say when coming to the hypothesis of like which kind of universe we're in, we wouldn't start with, well, there's one universe with a God and one universe without a God. We'd start with, we're in a universe and we form ideas in a certain way, and we know some of the ways we form ideas are wrong. So we have to start from the bottom up, not just start with there are two universes. So we can conclude that like if we have a belief that there are orange things in every box, and that's a belief inherent to humanity, and we think that we're all in a box, so we're all orange or something like that, we can conclude that, well, because that belief is formed in this very unreliable way that is false in every other case that doesn't have to do with evolution or whatever, we should conclude that belief is false. This is not the universe we're in. This is a bias that we have as in our psychology, and we should conclude this is wrong and just omit this entirely from our psychology until we have other reasons to believe that. So
well, what I'm trying to do with the scenario is not privilege any particular thought. And I think what the way that you're saying, well, you have to go from this starting point. Well, no, you don't. You can go from any starting point if it's objective. And so we could just as much say, well, there can't be any universe that exists without a God for these particular features of the universe or whatever. And we'd have to do a lot of assuming on what we meant by God and what his relationship to. So all that we need to presume is that because one universe exists and exists because of certain conditions, that those conditions also make it possible for a second one to exist. And we know that one universe, because there is the possibility that, or at least metaphysical possibility, that God exists now in this world. Well, it could exist in the other one. So, but we may be wrong, and that's just saying that in both universes, all of our experience, the kind of creature we are, those will be the same in both universes. The only thing that we might be wrong on is whether or not a universe exists, both universes exist without any God, or they both have a God. The reasonable thing to say in the scenario is that, okay, one might have a God and the other might not have a God. Or for a matter of fact, one does have a God, one doesn't. It really makes no difference other than to say, as far as metaphysics go, or if the physical world goes, God's existence makes zero difference to the way you and I live our lives, except for how we conceive of that God, which is the more interesting question I was trying to get to. When we're talking about ethics of belief, maybe you could just for that sake say, yes, it may be the case that the idea of God is, if it's not a properly basic belief, it's at least an epistemic entitlement, because some people can't find a way to logically get around this impasse. An example would be this two-universe scenario, and they have this compelling belief, or they have this compelling disbelief. And so they're entitled to those kinds of beliefs because they're doing their best to just understand how the world works, and nothing's come along to be able to defeat how they're believing or disbelieving. So maybe you can grant me that for the sake of saying that the next ethical question is, if a person just gives you the credit of saying, yes, I agree with you, I'm probably wrong in believing there's a God. However, I think that I would be unethical because I might be wrong that there's not a God, and I also believe God. I don't want to be a person that pretends about their beliefs. This is actually how I believe. And now I have to flesh out ideas about God and then see if they pan out, act on those beliefs to see if experience will revise those beliefs. And so that's the next ethical question that comes with saying that maybe there's a possibility that God is an epistemic entitlement. What do you do when you don't want to believe in God, but you do? And to me, the only genuine answer that you can give is that you live out your beliefs and you revise those beliefs because they can be defeated through experience. They can be defeated through reasoning and so on. So that's kind of the direction I'd like to see if you have any opinions on.
Oh yeah, so I would say that essentially it's analogous to the flat earther. Like if the flat earther is using all of their rational capacities that they can to the best of their ability, they're trying to assess truth, and all of the evidence they have just causes their brain to believe more in the flat earth. They're doing the best they can, and I grant them that they're doing the best that they can. And if you want to call that an entitlement, I'm happy to grant the flat earther is entitled and has an entitlement to believe the world is flat because they're using the best of their rational capacity. But objectively, independent of their subjective entitlement, I'd say that they're not. So in the same way, I could say the Christian could be subjectively have some kind of entitlement for their belief, but objectively, when you put it into the context of the wider body of knowledge, they do not. So I'd say that would probably be my response.
Okay, yeah. Well, again, I won't belabor the point. I just think that it's mistaken to think that God couldn't be an epistemic entitlement objectively. So that there are good reasons, and I've tried to list them or name them, the kind of creature we are, the kind of environment that would make it not necessarily a probably basic belief, but an epistemic entitlement in that category. And that may be something that we just ultimately disagree on and how it plays itself out in terms of.
I would say I still don't quite understand your argument in that sense. Like the kind of creature we are, like even if we have a proclivity to perceive a God, we're that kind of creature. I don't know what you mean by what kind of creature we are and what that relevance would have to the entitlement belief of a God.
Well,
can I jump in real quick, Stephen?
Yeah,
the kind of creature we are, we're Homo sapien. Earlier in the talk, you kind of distinguished us from the rest of the animals. We are animals. We have a 3.5 pound wet wired hard drive. The only difference is we have a prefrontal cortex, which makes us very unique with all the rest of the species, which we can foresee our own mortality. And as far as I know, maybe elephants, dolphins, I think maybe we're the only ones that know that we're going to die. And that with that comes a lot of liability. And I think that might have been the evolutionary reason we had to invent gods to give us a sense of comfort. Maybe I'm just spitballing.
Yeah, I don't know. Those would be particulars, and I'm not somebody that really cares about. I'll deny anybody that says that what they believe is true of God or how things work. If there's afterlives, I don't think there's afterlives. God may or may not exist. I'm more interested in the metaphysical question and how you would go about answering it. And again, when I talk about being a Christian, it's more about philosophical ethics and human well-being than it is about whether or not people can walk on water and snakes talk and all that kind of bullshit. So I have different, the way the questions come across to me have importance in different ways than most people that are thinking about the subject. So, as far as the epistemic entitlement stuff, what I mean by being a particular creature is just to say the basic empirical thing from the modern era. We think in certain ways because that's how we're geared to think. And we will think about the things that we think about given the inputs we're given that drive our thoughts. So the things that we think are ultimately have footing in an exterior or an external world to our minds. Those cause within us the kinds of beliefs that we have. And it's in conjunction with how we think. So again, with Kant, we couldn't experience anything at all without the idea of space and time and extension, things within the world that manifest in the world, and without causality. Those are some basic things about the kind of creature we are. We can't get away from thinking about things in those terms. But we also can't get away from, we can't just make things up because there's an external world that keeps us in check. So that's why I'm saying when someone has this idea that comes about naturally, that there may be something more to reality than just what meets the eye, and it may be more than just physical laws. There may be some conscious entity that's having an influence or affect on the way things are in the world. Those are certainly logically possible. They're metaphysically possible. What I want to know epistemically, though, is what would be a good defeater when we have to suppose that the metaphysics, first and foremost, are correct or aren't correct, when really they shouldn't be seen in terms of being true or false. They should be seen as provisional, where one acts on them when they flesh out ideas of what they mean by those metaphysical propositions. And I think that's where the conversation goes wrong immediately for Christian apologists. They really ought to take a class or two in philosophy. And then when you get people like Dillahunty or somebody else that talks about null hypothesis, and you should really not believe how many marbles are in there, because well, you can't stop yourself from believing things. And what do you do in those circumstances? You know that
Tom
I
is
agree with all of that.
Yeah,
So,
Tom is a rarity in the atheist community. We need more like him.
I want to just comment that, yeah, I agree with all of things Stephen said, and I would say that the default position, the position we should take, is that there is no God until some further evidence is provided, because we know there are these psychological problems humans have. And so if we consider the psychological beliefs that we have as being possibly true, should we believe those beliefs? Are those beliefs warranted? I would say no, because we know most of them are not true. So I would say that, yes, I agree that we can't prove with certainty one way or the other, and we have to try to assess which starting point we should take provisionally until further evidence is provided. I think the best provisional position to take is that there is no such thing as a conscious entity ruling the universe or outside of the universe until we have some other basis other than the fact that we formed the beliefs to come to that. I don't think entitlement or basic beliefs would ever justify that kind of a belief.
Well, that's where the problem comes in, because there are people that would love to do exactly what you're saying. What I'm saying is it's impossible to withhold belief. It's impossible to withhold doubt. It's impossible to withhold disbelief. Those are just things that you find yourself doing. And if there's no way to you may have a wonderful point with what you're saying, but if it doesn't have the effect on me that it has on you, what do I do with the beliefs that I have? Because if I had this genuine belief, like I'm open to being wrong, but I just don't think that I am, then I could suffer negative consequences in trying to force myself to believe. So one is a question of the ethics of belief, as far as believing only those things that are easily defended or most easily defended, which is what you're saying. Or there can be harm in trying to pretense in trying to say, no, I don't really genuinely, deeply believe this is the case. And if those are what entitlements are. That's what really, for me, make a difference between what something falls into as far as being a properly basic belief, something that's not justified by other beliefs, or something that is just, this is a brute fact of my makeup at this point in time. I believe this, I have no accounting for it. And I would like to believe something else if those things were able to convince me, but they're not. And so that's the kind of quandary that I'm in with this two universe thing, and trying to bring that up is, I don't think that for those kinds of people, you can settle anything. Because
I agree.
What you're saying is true. I want to believe exactly on the basis that you're saying. Yeah, but I can logically think of a scenario where that wouldn't be a defeater. And because I can think of that, it's not strong enough to overcome this natural compulsion that I have to believe. And so that's just a natural quandary that we have with the question.
Absolutely. So I totally agree that our psychologies are determined, and it's literally impossible to convince certain people of certain things. But I think that is all only relative or relevant to the topic of, is this subjectively a subjective entitlement? I don't think that any of those facts could tell us anything about whether that's an objective entitlement or not. So I think that as a subjective
entitlement,
in
one sense. It would in one sense, and that's, do ordinary people fall under this category? And that would be the only sense that you could say it's objective. But it's not a good epistemic base, because again, it's psychological. What do most psychological people do? But exactly what you're saying, psychological people do psychologically. They see agency where maybe there's none that exists. So yeah, it's just an interesting predicament, but that would make it objective to say any ordinary person under these circumstances would think these things, and they could fail to be correct.
Absolutely.
And that's
so
the
like if we
damnability
changed
of the whole thing, because we could probably agree that we're probably wrong, but what do we do? Because it would lead to psychological problems denying that this is what we actually believe. So
anyway.
Absolutely.
So like if we changed our brain states, like if I copied every one of your neurons, I would believe exactly the same thing you would, and I couldn't be able to change it. But when I mean objective entitlement, I mean, is there some kind of reason to believe it's true independent of just the fact that I believe it? Is there some correspondence to get beyond that? Is it just imaginary thing? So I totally agree with pretty much everything you said. I would just say that's the fact that you're unable to change your position is not sufficient to believe that your position is true about the world, even though you can't change it.
Yeah, well, I'm only going to, and maybe this will bring things to a close, or at least Jim can ask some questions. But I would say that's exactly what I'm trying to make support my argument. It's not just that I subjectively have this thing. It's that most people through time have this compulsion. They might not be able to reflect on reasons why they have it, but it's certainly objective in the fact that most people have that compulsion. But that's still, even though that makes it objective epistemically, that these kinds of conditions, the kind of thinkers we are in these kinds of conditions, lead most people to have this belief in some kind of God. It doesn't matter what the particulars are, but this metaphysical necessity of that thing seems to be an objective consequence of being a human being. But you're right. We may be wrong, and there are really good reasons to think we are. But I just don't think that it defeats the idea that it's an entitlement that everyone is warranted to objectively. And again, we may just disagree there. But at least I think we've covered a lot of ground in trying to figure out where the problems in the great debate conversation could occur, and maybe where some of the dialogue needs to change when we talk about default positions and what we should believe and shouldn't believe, when it really doesn't matter because we can't pick our beliefs. We can maybe show a good reason why or how our belief might match up with our right to live a certain way in response to having those beliefs. Or we might be able to do what is ideal and say, here are really good reasons that anyone should be able to understand and conclude something over something else. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a good topic for next time would be what would qualify as a good defeater for any particular belief. I think that would be a good next topic for something.
Yeah. Listen, it's good to meet you. And
I've got one saved round. If you guys want to entertain it, we got about 15 minutes left. If you just want to,
I have to get something to eat. I'm really hungry. So.
Shit. Okay. I'm going to throw it out here. If you want to bounce out, Tom, the AGI singularity is going to happen objectively in the next 50 years. Ideally in our lifetime, in the next 10 years or so, right?
Not very optimistic about your lifetime, huh?
Huh?
Not very optimistic about your lifetime, 10 years?
No, I'm not. No, yeah, too much has happened to me. I don't give myself much more time. So it will learn exponentially. And as soon as it becomes self-aware, it's going to be smarter than us in the first 48 hours, literally. What do you see the odds of it saying, "Oh, your human epistemology is all wrong. Here's the correct epistemology. Here's the way you should be coming at this problem." So now we're not talking a divine intelligence, a divine agent. We're talking about something we created, and it's telling us objectively, "You got it all wrong." How would that upend the validity of all your beliefs? And are we ready for this?
For me, it wouldn't make a difference at all. We are stuck with being human in the circumstances we are. We can't think any other way than we do. And so I can already admit that there could be some intelligence, more intelligent than me, and that even our formal logic systems, our mathematics, we might find in the end that that's just a construct of, or a consequence of how we think. And logic makes sense of it. It's not because it's ontologically has its own existence outside of minds, but that it makes sense because it makes sense. We dreamt it up. And it makes sense just because of the fact that we've made it coherent with other things that we believe. It could be happenstance. And it could be the same way with any other extra intelligence, whether it's artificial or alien or divine. There may be no absolute way of thinking about anything, and we could only judge in practical terms whether or not there's an advantage to thinking one way or another, if it's even possible for us to think any other way than we do.
I would say that if there's an AGI that comes about and is able to make novel testable predictions at a significantly higher rate than humanity, I'm going to go with whatever it says. I'm like, it's right, we're wrong, do what it says.
Amen, brother. That's where I'm at too.
That's probably smart.
And it's so ironic that the two atheists would just blind faith agree with the AGI and not God, but yeah, that's funny. Okay, gentlemen, any other saved rounds before we conclude?
I'm good. There was a great conversation. It was really nice meeting you. It was a pleasant conversation. So
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's always fun conversation. I like it.
Yeah, we got to do this again, and I think Tom already identified the next topic, so we'll book that as soon as we can. I'm right in the middle of this huge project, but as soon as I'm thinking I'll get done with that by maybe the end of May. I'm seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, so we'll get through that, and we'll see you guys next time.
All right,
see you later.
thanks.